All right, new Chumash and new study partner. So I'm excited to spend the book of Bamidbar with all of you with Nechama Leibowitz. Hard to give an adequate introduction, and I don't know if anyone around the Zoom had the privilege of studying with her personally. If you did, let us know. I think she really was a landmark figure in the 20th century of Torah study, in terms of someone who was able to bring together clear reading of a wide range of classical and modern and rabbinic and very contemporary commentaries on the Parashah around particular themes and questions. Someone who was incredibly devoted as a teacher, not just a purveyor of Torah content, but really as an instructor, and took very, very seriously her relationship with all of her students, and pushing them to read the text closely and carefully, the notion that there are questions for further study at the end of each essay is an indication of that. I expect we won't get a chance to delve into them, but they're there in the PDFs that we're going to share each week. And so many of our own teachers were her students or her students. I think she had an outsized influence on Torah study in our generation. Obviously, noteworthy given the disproportionate number of men scholars across our history. To have a woman teacher and scholar like her. A lot of study and analysis has been done of her method. I think one of the things that stands out, and in this way, I would say, she probably occupies some middle position amongst the different figures that we've learned with. She was someone who very much championed the notion of kabel et ha'emet mipi omro, accept the truth from wherever it comes, and didn't just limit herself to the most classical commentaries. Probably didn't stretch as far afield in terms of kinds of thinkers as Dr. Aviva Zornberg, and maybe not as often a recourse to non-Jewish commentaries as I think we saw some of in Rav Shai Held. But definitely, maybe I would say a wider reach than the typical that we saw with Rav Meidan. So just to positioning her somewhere on that spectrum. Oh, thank you. Let's see what Dara wrote in. Remember being in at least one class with her. Many of her Flatbush teachers were students of Nechama. So thank you. I'll try to make a few more comments, about her personality and her style over the coming weeks. Typically she has 4 or 5 essays on any given parasha. We also have many, many more collected, gilionot, her kind of parsha sheets, so to speak. A lot are accessible online, shorter treatments of different topics. And it's nice also that she comments on some weeks. I don't think every week. I didn't get a chance to skim the table of contents on the Haftarah as well, and offers insights there. I would say also kind of positioning her amongst our different thinkers and commentaries. There's less explicit meaning making going on here, and more of the notion that in the study of the Torah itself there is a great meaning, and in attempting to see the different ways in which commentaries approached an issue, and just laying out the spectrum of positions is itself a meaningful Torah study endeavor. There's less homiletical, work, certainly than Rav Shai, really different style than Aviva Zornberg. Maybe in certain ways closer to Rav Meidan in terms of focusing in on the text and sort of getting to the bottom of different approaches to the text. But I would say maybe the least homiletical, or at least invested in the meaning-making project of our various thinkers. And that leaves more room for just bringing more commentaries. As we'll see, most of this is really excerpts of commentaries, and she is kind of providing the framing. One thing that I find challenging in her reading is that she doesn't do that much. Not just does she not do that much work in meaning making, she also doesn't do that much work in these essays on what we might call sort of scaffolding. So as she moves from position to position, she doesn't sort of do for us the work of overly organizing or saying, okay, so now we have the first two commentaries taking this approach, and then these two commentaries taking this approach. It's in there, but you have to read more carefully and do more of the work yourself to sort of pull together the big picture. So we'll try to do that as we go. I'm going to share my screen and we will begin. So while this one is called Introduction, and she does look at a couple of the introductions to the book of Bamidbar, I think that her goal is actually to, through some of those introductions, to help us understand more what's going on in particular in the first couple of parashiot of the book. So that's where she will sort of extrapolate or focus in on from amongst the different introductions to the whole book that she's brought here. And it's a great project to study the introductions to the Chumashim. Some of the commentaries wrote short introductions, others did not. For example, Rashi did not write any, comment on each of the books before his comments on the first verse. But some other commentaries did. They would write short comments before the beginning of each of the books. Ramban, perhaps the most famous amongst them, and that's where she begins. So here we go. In his introduction to the fourth book of the Pentateuch, Nachmanides, that's the Ramban, 13th century, summarizes its general character and significance, placing it in the context of the arrangement of all the 5 books of Moses. And here we have an extended excerpt of the Ramban's introduction to Bamidbar. So here we go. In the third book, Vayikra, the Torah explained the laws of the sacrifices. Now we are instructed regarding the precepts connected with the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed. God hedged the tabernacle around with restrictions, just as God did with respect to Mount Sinai when God's glory rested thereon. Compare, the stranger that draws near will be put to death. That's in towards the end of the first chapter of Bamidbar. And you should set bounds to the people round about, saying, take heed to yourselves that you not go up onto the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. That's Shemot chapter 19, talking about the preparations for the revelation at Mount Sinai. In Bamidbar, chapter 4, verse 20, God the Almighty commanded, but they shall not go in to see when the holy things are covered, lest they die. By the way, I think our last essay on Bamidbar before the Haftorah talks about what exactly this verse is all about. In Exodus 19:21, it is stated, charge the people lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. Regarding the tabernacle, it's stated, you should keep charge of the sanctuary, that there be no wrath on the children of Israel. That's already halfway into the book in Bamidbar chapter 18. Regarding Sinai, it's stated, let the priests also who come near to the Lord sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. Okay, so just in this first paragraph, the Ramban has noted for us 3 parallels between, the boundaries and limitations and consequences vis-a-vis Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, and compared them to the similar types of boundaries around the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in our book, Bamidbar. Bamidbar contains detailed instructions, therefore, regarding the charge of the tabernacle, the order of the encampments, the standing of the people afar, only the priests coming near the Lord, all to enhance the glory of the tabernacle, as our sages said. The palace of the king, which is surrounded by sentinels, cannot be compared to that which is not so surrounded, right? So obviously something is shown to be, it's reflective of the honor of a thing, and it shows honor to the thing to have guardians all around it. That's much more than if there were not guardians all around it. So that enhances the glory of the tabernacle, to have all these restrictions and guardians. This whole book is concerned with temporary precepts, commanded them for their stay in the wilderness, and the miracles performed for them, to relate all the wondrous deeds of God. It relates that God began to deliver their enemies to them by the sword, and contains instructions how they were to divide the land. There are few precepts of permanent validity in this book, it also finishes off the subject of the sacrificial laws begun in Leviticus. So we can see that the, Ramban certainly is making connections between Vayikra and Bamidbar, spends most of the time seeming to focus, or at least what she's excerpted for us here, seeming to focus on the importance of this idea of the Mishkan being like a portable Har Sinai and all the comparisons between them. She's going to explicate this a little more as well. And then, quickly mentions all the rest of the things that Bamidbar is about. According to Nachmanides, then, the tabernacle which moved in the midst of the camp was a kind of Mount Sinai on which the Torah was given, accompanying them on all their journeys. This is an important idea, which is sort of credited to the Ramban, may or may not have been the first one to point it out, but this idea of thinking about the tabernacle as a portable Mount Sinai. Beno Jacob, in his work on the Pentateuch, follows up this idea of Nachmanides, quote from Beno Jacob, much more contemporary commentator. The Lord transferred God's presence from Sinai to the tabernacle, from the sanctuary of the Lord, which God's hands had established. That seems to be a way of talking about Mount Sinai, interestingly. I guess it's a naturally occurring space where God came to reside for a short time, to the sanctuary which Israel had made. The Lord would henceforth speak to Moses from the tent of meeting and indicate to Israel by means of the cloud when to journey and when to encamp. The tabernacle was a mobile Sinai in the midst of them. The heavens of heavens, the holy place and most holy place, transplanted and brought down to earth. So it's just, developing further this idea of the Ramban. We may now understand the reason for the detailed treatment given by the Torah in the first Sidra of Bamidbar to the camp, its arrangement and standards. That same camp house, one boundary within another, the tabernacle which accompanied them in their midst. So she's now trying to transition from this big picture that the Ramban develops in his introduction, why all these guidelines and laws that are similar to Mount Sinai, because the tabernacle is a mobile Mount Sinai and God's presence is in the center. And therefore, we have to be very conscious and attentive, to all the boundaries and concentric circles that are placed around it. And that's why there's a lot of thought indicated and a lot of detail explicated around the arrangement of the camp, because the tabernacle is at its center. As Rabbi Yehuda Halevi explains in his Kuzari, the camp and its divisions are to be compared to the body and its constituent limbs, the tabernacle being to the camp what the heart is to the body. So even though, most of Bamidbar and its descriptions are talking about, which tribes are arrayed on which, directions and that kind of thing, what we're meant to have in mind is all of this matters because this is some intentional organization that is significant because the Mishkan is in the middle and God's presence is in the middle. This is the reason for detailing the bearers of the tabernacle and its various appurtenances, right? Then the next inner circle is the Levite families who were charged with carrying the disassembled parts of the Mishkan and its supplies and things like that. Again, we shall resort to Halevi's explanation. All these appurtenances required bearers, quoting again from the Kuzari. The Levites were specially assigned to this task because they were nearer to God, especially after the incident of the golden calf, when they alone had shown undivided loyalty to the Almighty. Elazar, the priest, being the most distinguished of them, was chosen for the most sacred and refined task of taking charge of the oil for the lamp, the incense, and the continual meal offering and oil of anointing, all of which are distinguished by the pure fire and the light of wisdom and knowledge. And what is more, the light of prophecy in the Urim and Tumim. The most distinguished Levitical clan after him, the sons of Kahat, were assigned the task of bearing the inner limbs, such as the ark, table, candlestick, altars, and holy vessels for service. Of them it is stated, for the service of the holy things belonged to them, they bore them upon their shoulders. So this is all to sort of lay out a first approach in which the Ramban is telling us that by comparison to Har Sinai and seeing the same laws and guidelines around establishing borders and high stakes limitations of seeing and touching Har Sinai and seeing and setting up guardians around it and seeing those parallels to the Mishkan, we see that the Mishkan is a portable Har Sinai, and therefore the array of the camp all around it takes on more significance because it starts with the priests and then the Levites and then the Israelites, all with their extending outwards levels of sanctity, their respective jobs of taking the holiest and then the less holy and then serving in a sense as guardians all around it. Right now we can understand that the all the tribes who were not Levites still had a role. They were an outer flank of guardians around the Mishkan. Okay, let's go on a little further. Let us compare this view. Okay, this is a next Nechama Leibowitz point. Pulling a few different commentaries together to map out one general position. And now we get the next. Let us compare this view of the role of the camp and its structure with that emerging from Abravanel's introduction to Bamidbar. The first book of the Torah, Breshit. One of the things, by the way, I would just say, and this was true, I think, about everybody we've studied, along the way, as they're, marshaling texts to build up their overall point, we get exposed to wonderful texts which we might not otherwise have seen. So here's Abravanel's introduction to Bamidbar. She wants to make a point that pertains to Bamidbar, but here we get to see, a fascinating broader point. The first book of the Torah, Breshit, traces the ancestry and origins of the children of Israel from the creation of the world until they entered the Egyptian exile. The second book relates of their exile and redemption, in the physical sense from Egyptian bondage, and in the spiritual from the idolatrous beliefs they entertained and from which they were weaned at Sinai, and how they were commanded to build a tabernacle so that the divine presence could rest on them. The third book initiates them into sanctity and purity and into the service of the sanctuary, exhorting both the priests and the people to refrain from abominable and evil rites. The fourth book relates of the leading of the people, their system of journeyings and encampments, their vicissitudes on the way, explaining why they were delayed 40 years there, until the generation that had left Egypt had died out, and what happened to Korach and his company who rebelled against Moses and Aaron. Incidentally, for reasons which will be explained, this account introduced precepts specifically ordained for all time, such as that of tzitzit, the red heifer, the laws of inheritance, the priestly blessing, the suspected adulteress, the Nazarite, the cereal burnt offering, its libations, the continual offerings and appointed seasons, additional offerings, vows, cities of refuge, and Levitical and priestly gifts, the order of their journeyings, all dictated by divine wisdom and leadership. Already we see a significant contrast, which is, the Abravanel sees a lot of mitzvot that were ordained for all time, whereas the, Ramban told us most of the mitzvot in the book are temporary precepts, and there happened to just be a few that wound up in there. And, he does say that they were here incidentally. They're somehow all related to other topics which are more central, but there's certainly a different emphasis or weight on whether eternal mitzvot have a significant place in the book of Bamidbar or not. The book describes in its 10 sections. We have something else different here, a kind of breaking it down, making note of the units. The book describes in its 10 sections how Moshe led and provided for the people when they were in the wilderness, the acts of their power and might, order of their journeyings and their encampments and battles, and what befell them with Moab and Midian, Balak and Bilam, in the war of Sichon and Og, the kings of the Amorite, and the granting of their land to Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, and all else that befell them till they came to their resting place and inheritance. The 10 sections which comprise Bamidbar can be divided into two parts. The first comprising the first 5, Bamidbar naso balot chashlach korach. The second, the remaining sidrot, Chukat, Balak, Pinchas, Matot, Maseh. I don't know if this is the entire introduction. I didn't check. But if so, it's not particularly different in length than the Ramban's, but you can see how different it is in that it has much more of a survey view, and the Ramban seemed to spend much more time on kind of the notion of the Mishkan as really delving in on one point and then saying the rest are details, whereas Abravanel has much more of a taking us through every dimension with some almost like equal weight.
Yeah, what was she saying about are they saying about the comparison of the first 5 parshiot and then the second 5?
Yeah, so so thank you, Dara. Good question. That's inside the Abravanel's introduction. So it's his point, not Nechama's, but he seems to be saying that he doesn't tell us the basis for the division, but he seems to be telling us that the book can be divided into 2 parts: the first 5 parshiot and the second 5 parshiot. And again, it's I guess just on a first glance, I assume that that's a chronological differentiation, because we traditionally ascribe that Parshat Chukat sort of picks up at year 38 or something like that, whereas certainly Shlach and even Korach is all in the first couple of years. Certainly potentially some debate about Korach, but so I assume, again, I haven't looked at the commentators on Abravanel, but I assume that division, first 5, second 5, is sort of the first 5 are all basically year 2 in the wilderness, year 1 and 2 in the wilderness, and then Chukat, Balak, Pinchas, Matod, Maseh are basically years 39 and 40 in the wilderness. So they're sort of just 2 different periods of time, because we certainly could talk about other divisions, but so I think that's what Abravanel is getting at when saying we can divide it into 2. The first period of the wilderness wanderings, long gap, and then the last 5 parshiot are the end of the wilderness period. Our Sidra then, now we're back to, that's the end of Abravanel's intro, and now we're back to Nechama's words. Our Sidra then comes to tell us of the leading of the people, their system of journeyings and encampments. So now what she's doing is taking the Abravanel's whole introduction to all of Bamidbar and now saying, okay, which portion of Bamidbar of Sefer Bamidbar is our Parashah Bamidbar. What does he describe that as? What's the language he uses there? And so when it says the 4th book relates to the leading of the people, their system of journeyings and encampments, vicissitudes on the way, why they were delayed 40 years, etc., she's saying particularly it's the leading of the people, their systems of journeyings and encampments. That's what Parashat Bamidbar, or maybe Bamidbar and some of Naso, is about. Describing the layout of the camp, the biblical narrative notes, Ish al diglo v'otot leveit avotam, this is chapter 2, verse 2, Yachanu b'nei Yisrael mineged, Saviv la'ohel moed yachanu. Every man of the children of Israel shall pitch by his own standard with the ensign of their father's house. Far off the tabernacle of the congregation shall they pitch. Some commentators, she continues, consider that the arrangement of the camp of every man by his own standard and the roll call of the people that preceded bear the character of military preparation for conquest of the land. This indeed is the view taken by Rashbam, who is a master of brevity and is always concerned to bring out the plain literal meaning of the text, or pshat, as it is termed in Hebrew. Commenting on the verse, chapter 1, verse 2, take ye the sum of all the congregation of Israel, he states that the Almighty ordered them to be numbered from 20 years old and upwards in the struggle for the promised land to which they had begun to proceed, directed by the pillar of cloud which arose on the 20th of the 2nd month. It was in preparation for this that the Almighty commanded them to be numbered at the beginning of the month. Rashbam explains further that the Levites were not numbered along with the children of Israel because they were not eligible for army service, but were appointed to watch over the tabernacle of testimony. Other commentators take up the same attitude and explain the arrangement of the ensigns as one of military order, adopted in the interest of security. So I want to say that it's not totally clear to me yet how she is using Abravanel, right? She wants us to compare Ramban to Abravanel. We understand Ramban's approach to the ordering of the camp is concentric circles around the Mishkan relating to, increasing or decreasing levels of holiness and responsibility to protect or be protected from God's presence in the tabernacle at the center. That's clearly Ramban, because that's how he understands the tabernacle of portable Har Sinai. Then she brings the Abravanel, and what she seems to pull out from the Abravanel is that our Sidra is telling us the leading of the people, their system of journeyings and encampments, but she doesn't indicate to us what she thinks Abravanel's take on the leading of the people and their system of journeyings and encampments is. So that's left a little open, it seems to me. I can't yet tell for sure what she wants us to do with that. And now it seems like we might even already, either that's a lead-in to the next people she's quoting, or it stands alone somehow. And now we're on to the third approach, which begins but with the Rashbam, which is that the reason for going into all this detail and the underlying organizing principle of the arrangement of the camp is a preparation for war. It's a military layout and arrangement. And now she continues, in this connection to the Ramban, the Rashbam rather's approach, that the arrangement is of military order. The comments of Lutzato, Shadal, whom she is a big fan of and quotes frequently, certainly more than most, are worth quoting. So here's Shadal's comment. After the tabernacle had been erected, and they were proceeding towards the promised land to conquer it under divine leadership, it was desirable for them to be divided in accordance with their standards and groupings, so that everyone would know his place and the camp be properly ordered, that they should not appear as runaway slaves, but constitute a people ready for battle. They were therefore numbered as a part of the policy of instituting order. In this connection, our sages rightly made the point that when God came to rest God's divine presence amongst them, God numbered them. Okay, let's hear how she takes Shadal's comment. It is surprising that Lutzato does not sense that the whole attempt to supply strategic or military motives for the camp arrangement is not in consonance with, or at least does not offer an adequate explanation for the complete understanding of all that was involved in the arrangement of the tribes around the tabernacle, their numbering, and the exclusion of the Levites from the roll call. Indeed, the suitability of this type of explanation is vitiated rather than supported by Lutzato's rabbinic quotation to the effect that when God came to rest God's divine presence on them, I'm not sure if that's Moshe, maybe, numbered them. Indeed, a better understanding of the whole chapter can only be arrived at when we remember that the focal point of the camp was the tabernacle and the tribe of Levi that encamped round about it. This was the tabernacle which Nachmanides considered to be a sort of substitute for Mount Sinai, a projection of it that moved in the midst of the camp, as stated in our citation of his introduction to Bamidbar. God hedged the tabernacle around with restrictions, just as God did with respect to Mount Sinai when God's glory rested there. I'm going to pause for a brief moment. I want to leave this section open because when I come back, I want us to try to work together to understand what she's saying in this paragraph. So I will be back in a moment. We will continue in a moment. Okay. I'll pause for a moment just in case anybody wants to offer an initial thought or reaction to what we've seen so far, and then we'll try to pull this bulk of it together so far. We can stop the share, and Dad, go ahead.
Okay, I was thinking when you talked about the sentinel or sentinels guarding, I was thinking of the Garden of Eden. And although it does not have, to my knowledge, concentric circles of different levels of holiness. But what I'm thinking is that there's God has different relationships to the people who minister in the tabernacle, to Moshe, who is on Mount Sinai, and to Adam and Eve. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that maybe God's relationship with Adam and Eve is the closest he ever comes. I don't know if anybody ever comments on that. I mean, certainly about Moshe, God spoke to him face to face, and you speak to a friend. But God just talks to Adam and Eve. So I'm just wondering if there's another place in this group of pictures that is being drawn at the beginning of Bamidbar.
Interesting. So just say a little bit more. Are you seeing them as primarily similar or dissimilar? And also, why did the sentinels make you think of Gan Eden?
Because the cherub is standing at the entrance.
Good. Just wanted to spell that out. Right after they're banished, we're told that God places, Kruvim and a revolving fiery sword or something to guard the Garden of Eden. Right.
So I'm thinking what is similar is God has a specific relationship with the people in the Mishkan. It's the Kohanim and Levim in Mount Sinai and Moses also, but the work in the Mishkan is not done by Moshe anymore. I mean, he may have ultimately been the person who constructed it. And on Mount Sinai, it's almost all Moshe, except the one incident in the end of Mishpatim, where the elders and Aaron come up. Whereas in the Garden of Eden, God has a very different relationship with a very, admittedly, limited number of people at that point.
So in other words, just thinking about taking this model of the two that's been created by the Ramban of the Mishkan and Har Sinai, and drawing a parallel to a third, which is the Garden of Eden, some kind of special place where God's presence seems to reside, and there are also people in there, and there's more direct, intimate communication and connection with the people inside that space. Yeah. So I guess the questions are there other examples quite like that? And then what do we draw from the similarities and differences? Yeah, I think that's a fascinating to think about. One thing that comment that you made about concentric circles, it does say Eitz HaChaim betoch Hagan.
Yeah.
But we don't know if that particularly means that the tree of life is in the middle or just is somewhere in the garden. We don't have much spatial orientation or layout. That's a great question. I don't have any initial thoughts, but I think it's something to definitely think about and think if there are other examples like that. Great. Thank you. Lance, go ahead.
Question, who is the suspected adulteress?
That is the Sota. That's the story of the Sota and the waters which test the Sota. I get it. That legal section is in Naso in the second of the portions.
Very good. And where is mention of the Paschal Lamb sacrifice?
So right. Numbers chapter 9, if I remember right, talks about the offering in the wilderness, and then the second, the Pesach Sheni. I don't think did Abravanel mention that?
I couldn't see.
You're pointing out that people don't note that as a significant content item in Bamidbar. Yeah, I think that's true. It doesn't even merit mention, it seems like.
Because it's not done.
Right. Well, I believe the Ramban actually is one of the commentaries who really talks about that question. Certainly, he argues that most of the holiday offerings were not offered in the wilderness, if I recall correctly. I don't remember what stance he takes about the Korban Pesach, which we certainly have indication happened in the first year after their leaving, but maybe not the subsequent years. That's a great topic for further exploration.
And also when Joshua gets to the promised land in chapter 5 of his book, the Paschal Lamb is sacrificed. However, there's no mention whatsoever of the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Right, right. Yes, okay. Seth points out that Abravanel does say appointed seasons, additional offerings. Right. So those are what we would call the korbanot musafim, which are discussed in I think maybe in chapter 15. I'm not sure about that. No, that's talking about even later in around 23 or 24 or 25. There's a different section that particularly deals with the Passover around chapter 9. And so it's unclear if that gets folded into that reference of Abravanel or if he just chooses not to. He doesn't touch on every single item here. So, but thank you, Seth. That's a good possibility that he
But
might.
Isn't the sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb something that is supposed to be forever?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. By forever, do you mean
That we're supposed to be doing it right now.
Yeah, that's a hotly debated topic.
And only non-Jews like Samaritans do it.
Right. Great. Okay, let's go on a little further. There were not just.
Did you see my question? I wrote if this is a translation.
Oh, is it a translation? Yes, it is. Let me get the book. Hold on. I didn't even check who did the translation. Translated and adapted from the Hebrew by Aryeh Newman on the edition that I have here. So yes, it was written originally in Hebrew. I didn't check against the Hebrew here, so I can't comment on the quality of the translation, although I certainly am inclined to trust it. But yes, this is a translation of Nechama. Yeah. All right, let's go on a little further. So just to come back to where she seems to be making, not just quoting and summarizing, but trying to make a, take a stance on, at least one of the approaches. And here, I'm not totally sure what to make of it. What's happening in this paragraph, she seems to be saying that Shadal's analysis, Luzzato's analysis, where he says, constitute a people ready for battle, has the reading that the organization, the ordering of the camp, and the census is part of preparation for battle. She seems to be saying that that's not a good enough explanation of all the details about how the tribes were arranged, right? Their numbering, the exclusion of Levites from the roll call. It's what I'm not sure about. What's curious to me about it is that some of those details are explained by the Rashbam, right? The Rashbam, includes why the Levites were not numbered because they weren't eligible for military service, why the Jewish people were numbered because they were getting ready for this battle. So it seems to me that she's just saying Rashbam covers all of these things. Shadal alludes to the idea that this is here, that the arrangement of the camp, is reflective of a readiness for military conflict, but he doesn't introduce certain details which could support this point, and he just sort of leaves out. That's what she seems to be saying. Not that she's critiquing his, supporting the position that the arrangement of the camp is reflective of military preparation, but just that, he's not including what the Rashbam seems to include, which is an explanation of certain other details which could support that point, but he just doesn't mention them. That's what it seems to me she's saying. But I think she's also critiquing this approach, the military arrangement altogether, when she says, right, a better understanding of the chapter can only be arrived at when we realize that, the tabernacle is at the center, Levi is encamped around it, and Levi has these special roles in the Mishkan. So it seems to me like she's preferencing, and again, where the Abravanel fits in, still not totally clear to me, but it seems to me like she's preferencing the Ramban's approach to the Rashbam's and Shadal's approach. That's how I'm understanding it so far. Hirsch makes, now I come to Rav Hirsch. Hirsch makes the following illuminating comment on the parallels between Mount Sinai and the tabernacle in his commentary at the end of the book of Exodus. So Moshe finished the work. This is the end of Parashat Pekudei, when the Mishkan is finished being constructed and erected. So Moshe finished the work, and the cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This signified that the whole process of erecting the tabernacle had been accomplished in consonance with the divine will, as God had commanded Moshe, and that its original purpose, as expressed in the phrase, "They shall make me a sanctuary and I will dwell therein," had been achieved. Right, because it says that when Moshe finished, God's glory filled the Mishkan. That shows us that the Mishkan, whose goal was for God to come dwell in it, now was filled with God's presence. Now we know the goal of the construction project was already achieved. The same as it is recorded regarding Mount Sinai, that the glory of the Lord above upon Mount Sinai. So it was now, after the Torah had found its earthly resting place in the tabernacle, in the place set aside for the revelation of God's glory below, right? So another kind of textual parallel showing that just as God's glory came to rest on Har Sinai, now when the tabernacle was complete at the end of Shemot, God's glory came to rest in it. And that supports the idea that the Mishkan is this portable Mount Sinai, place for God's glory to rest. This same thought is expressed in Psalm 68:18. The Lord is among us as in Sinai, in the holy place. Just the same as it is recorded regarding Mount Sinai that the cloud covered it 6 days. On the seventh day, God called unto Moshe out of the midst of the cloud. So the point is made regarding the tabernacle, that Moshe was not able to enter the tabernacle of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon. Only after that does he state at the beginning of Vayikra that God called to Moshe and spoke unto him, right? So that there's actually a potential conflict between God's presence and the presence of anyone else. So once God was on Har Sinai, Moshe couldn't go up until Moshe was summoned. So too, with the Mishkan, once God came to dwell in it, Moshe couldn't go in until God summoned him. And so it quite clearly emerges that the tabernacle that went in the midst of the camp of the Levites was the center of the camp of Israel, just as the heart is the center of the body, as Halevi noted in our quotation from the Kuzari. The arrangement of the camp, the ensigns, and the roll call are thus seen in another light from that viewed by the literalists, the Pashtanim, whom we cited earlier. So again, she seems to be, and I'm still not sure where the Abravanel fits in, seems to be setting up for the military approach, even though he doesn't seem to be quite explicit about it. So she's taking those who adopt this military approach as the literalists, the Pashtanim, and seems to be preferencing the approach that understands all these details as sort of pointing to arrangements made in order to best situate everyone where they should be vis-a-vis the Mishkan at the center, as opposed to arrangements made to explain or set everybody up to be best positioned for a military, conquest or conflict. To these, the strategist among them, we may tender the same answer as that given by the king of the Chazars, that's in the Kuzari, when he heard the words of the philosopher, whose reasoning appealed to his mind, but not his heart. He said, "In these divine matters, there are secrets beyond those you have mentioned, O philosopher." What she seems to be saying to us is, while the literalists are making a good argument, right, there's something to their point that the arrangement reflects a military, setup. It's not sufficient, maybe. It's necessary, but not sufficient. There is a deeper meaning or notion here, which is that it is about kind of arraying as appropriate around the Mishkan at the center. That almost the focus is sort of looking towards the center as opposed to the big picture, looking almost sort of forward to whatever we might encounter on the other side in a moment of conflict or military encounter. Now is the time to turn to the inspiring words.
Sounds like he was reading Hamlet.
What's that?
Sounds
The
like
king
he
of the
was reading
Chazars is reading Hamlet. Which line from Hamlet? Oh, Miriam, say that. Can you say which line from Hamlet you had in mind, Miriam?
I can say it.
Sorry, I keep muting myself. Where Hamlet speaks to Horatio. There are more things on this earth, paraphrasing wildly, that are dreamed of in your philosophy, Horatio.
Correct.
There are more things.
100%. That's it.
Okay. All right. Miriam and Lance working together here. Great. Great. Okay, now it's time to turn to the inspiring words of the Midrash and its treatment of the verse, every man by his own standard with the ensign. Now, by the way, here we now have a Midrash quoted in Hebrew and then the translation in English, something I have not yet come to understand, but we'll, or look into, but we'll keep an eye as we go through. When does the English translator here, Aryeh Newman, choose to preserve texts in the original Hebrew? So far we saw a pasuk quoted in Hebrew, and now here a midrash. I just haven't checked through whether this is sort of a difference between, biblical and rabbinic texts are presented in Hebrew, whereas all subsequent medieval commentaries and beyond are presented only in the English. I'm not sure yet. We'll have to keep our eye out and see. Already flipping through, I see there are some rabbinic texts which are in English only. There might be a Rashi here that's in Hebrew. So I'm not sure what the editorial decision is about when to present some of the texts in their Hebrew original, always with English translation. But given that this is in an English translation in and of itself, when are things kept also in the original Hebrew? Okay, so here's the Midrash. We'll go right to the English translation. This verse recalls Deuteronomy. So here on the verse, every man by his own standard with the ensign, Ishal Diglo Leotot, I think is what's being quoted here, Ishal Diglo Leotot. So on that verse, this verse from our Parashah recalls Deuteronomy 32:10, where it says, God found him in a desert land and in the waste, a howling wilderness. Yimtsaehu be'eretz midbar uvetohu yelel yeshimon. The Lord recovered a valuable lost property in Israel, meaning in the people Israel are that valuable lost property. As it is said in Hosea, your little connection to Rav Shai, we were quoting Hosea chapter 11, I think last week, with God's undying love of Israel. So here we are back to Hosea around the same area. As it says in Hosea chapter 9, as a vine in the wilderness I found Israel. So God found him in a desert land. The world was desert until the Israelites went from Egypt. And in the waste, a howling wilderness, waste and dark, uvetohu yelel, and yelel connected to Laila. Waste and dark was the world before Israel left Egypt and before they had received the Torah. But as soon as Israel had gone forth from Egypt and received the Torah, what then does it say? And then now we're continuing on this sort of extended midrash, connecting our parasha to Ha'azinu. Yesovevenhu, God compassed him about, implying that God compassed him or surrounded him with clouds of glory. I guess Yevonanehu, God instructed him with words of Torah. Yitzurenhu, God watched over him. Happy the ears that heard how much God loved them, watched over them, and guarded them, as if they were the apple of God's eye, so to speak. So again, we have this sort of, this midrash is trying to build up the idea, we haven't gotten to the link yet, build up the idea that when the Jewish people were in Egypt, we were this lost property and the whole world was somehow lost and dark during our exile and servitude. When we came out and ultimately received the Torah, there was this restoration for us and God and for the whole world, and it went sort of immediately from this time of darkness and desolation to this time of glory and teaching and protection. See how God watched and guarded them. God said to Moshe, tell them to make a tabernacle in their midst, as I am leaving my upper realm, as it were, and descending to dwell amongst them. This is, the midrashic idea, which is very strong, where the instructions to build the tabernacle in Parashat Truma appear. That God is saying, I want to come and dwell amongst you, so you've got to build a residence for me. Moreover, right now here we're going to get to the part that's relevant specifically to Bamidbar, to the array of the camp at large and these standards or ensigns. Moreover, God made them serve under God's ensign. The Holy One said to Moses, make them ensigns in my name. For what reason? Because they are my children. As it is written, you are the children of the Lord your God, and they are my hosts. As it is said, and bring forth my armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So through this link, the rabbis are sort of understanding that the Jewish people are God's army. That's what hosts here in the sense of army. For
What's
this
the word
reason,
in Hebrew, please? Sometimes I don't. What the ENSIGN? What is that in Hebrew, please?
that's degel,
Okay, thank you.
diglo, degel. Aseotam digalim lishmi is the midrashic phrase. Make them ensigns, flags, standards, something like that. For my name or in my name. Why? Because they are my children. They are my hosts. For this reason, it states the standard of the camp of Judah southward, according to their armies, right? Letzivotam. Because they are my armies, I shall make them into my standard bearers. Lefishahem tzivotai ese otam digalim lishmi. So this midrash, in certain ways, seems to kind of bring together. And again, this is the challenge with Nechama, is like she doesn't spell it out for us. So I'm not even sure whether what I'm saying is her intention or not. But it seems like what's happening in this last piece is using this midrash as an attempt to kind of bring together the two ideas, that this notion of kind of military preparation and military encampment, while the Jewish people are God's army because of the intimate relationship we have, God is now coming to dwell in our center, in the Mishkan. So we array ourselves in a way which somehow, yes, reflects military, but not military just for conquest's sake, but military in the sense of this surrounding protective army of God, which has God at its center. And so in some sense, again, this midrash, on these standards, the standards could have a military sense, but the standards are God's flags, and we are somehow becoming the flag of God in the world. And so again, I think it's somehow an attempt to bring together the two ideas that, what Rav Meidan would want us to understand is that the rabbis, saw the military sense of the arrangement of the camp, and also understood the significance of the tabernacle being at the center, and composed a midrash which somehow tried to synthesize the two of them. And so as we read the first parashah and a little bit the beginning of the second, we have these two not necessarily conflicting, but coexisting approaches to understanding the array of the camp, the Levites in the center, the reason for the census at this time, the different jobs of the different people, and there's more to develop from there. Questions or comments? Lance, I also want to wish Robert Moshe a Mazal Tov on the birth of granddaughter. Did I remember right? Yeah, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Yeah, Lance, go ahead.
Okay, in the Wikipedia article on Professor Leibowitz, we read this. When asked to describe her, Professor Leibowitz's methods, she replied, "I have no derech. I only teach what the commentaries say. Nothing is my own."
Mm-hmm.
Her, as far as I can see, her teaching approach is to elicit thinking and participation from the students. That's her whole life, I think, is dedicated to getting students to think for themselves, come up with ideas, and present them.
Yeah.
Unlike,
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Miriam.
I can vouch for that because when my husband was a student in Israel, he studied with Nechama. And this sounds like it was a struggle for the editor to pull it together, because he must have been working from her notes and whatever he could glean from other sources. And I assume that that's why it's so difficult to discern a specific intentional purpose.
Yeah, that actually may be the case, and I'm not sure. Now I'm going to try to look into more. How are these translations?
I think that this is a collection of her study sheets that she's put together, and so it's less of a dedicated translation of her work than a collection of the study sheets she used to hand out.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. I'll try to get a little more information on that for next time, so we can understand how these were constructed.
I have one more quote. If
The translator's forward actually just talks about this.
Yes,
right
yeah, I
at the
see
beginning.
some of that. I see some of that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
And,
He
hold on one
writes-
second, Lance. Hold on one
Oh.
second. I also want to just appreciate Seth's comment that it makes me think more of a military parade, a la May Day parades, than an active military getting ready for attack. I think it's a beautiful way of sort of synthesizing the two. It's like a show. There's a military dimension, but not focused on impending conflict as much as on kind of a display of pride or mission in some way. Yeah,
And order. He
Yes,
doesn't
and
want them
order,
to be
very
a
much.
ragtag group of slaves.
right, exactly as Shadal said as well. Okay, go ahead, Lance. Last word.
Okay. Nevertheless, this is from another essay on Bamidbar. Nevertheless, we have no greater believer in miracles, both hidden and revealed in Jewish history, than Nachmanides. It was Nachmanides who said, "No one of us can have a portion in the law of Moses, our teacher, unless we believe that in all matters and circumstances affecting us, we are surrounded by miracles, and that they are not just natural and ordinary phenomena." Now, I would suggest that she's wrong in a sense that Nachmanides didn't believe, Nachmanides saw. In other words, he saw hidden miracles, he saw the miracles hidden. And I think Nachmanides is obviously someone she loves. And this is a little bit of an insight as to her derech.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, we'll try to, like I said, I wasn't adequately prepared to fully address it this week. We'll try to get some more on that. And I know the forward here or preface references a couple of essays in the earlier volumes. I'll see what I can collect and share as well. Scott, yes, last word. Awesome.
So I'm embarrassed to admit that I was registered for a course with Nahama Leibovitz in 1970-71 at Hebrew University. And after a few classes, I dropped out of the class because it was terribly intimidating. And what Lance mentioned in terms of how she ran the class, it was a huge lecture hall. And she had a roll book, and she would call on people to get their reactions to whatever it is she said. And when Lance and Miriam were talking about the quotation from Shakespeare, she was wont to quote from all kinds of literature, and ask where there was a quote that was similar to what was being written. It was very intimidating. Her 19-year-old me. And it's still, in reading it, it still seems to be somewhat disjointed, without a conclusion, without offering us a conclusion. But yeah.
Great. Thank you that's one of the wonderful things about studying modern folks is we have various points of connection and experiences to share. So thank you. And looking forward to continuing as we go through Bamidbar. Thanks, everybody. Love to mom and dad, and good night to all.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. Great group.